thank you all very much for coming to this Free Speech Union event at the Battle of Ideas. The purpose of this event is to talk to some of the people that have been targeted for cancellation over the past 18 months, few years, and find out how they fought back, in some cases with our help, and to try and draw some general conclusions from that about how we can all push back against cancel culture. Just briefly, before we get to that, and I want to try and give everyone 5 minutes to tell their story, and then we'll throw it open to you and hopefully have about an hour to answer your questions and discuss these issues together. But just briefly, I and some other people set up the Free Speech Union last February. The timing was quite fortuitous because it was just before both the pandemic struck and the Black Lives Matter movement got an incredible turbo boost from the killing of George Floyd, and both of those things seem to result in the acceleration of cancel culture and made it much more difficult to dissent, at least from those particular narratives. And we ended up helping many more people than we'd originally anticipated. We grew quite quickly. We now have almost 9,000 members, 12 full-time, 12 employees, not all of them full-time. We get about 50 requests for help a week from people who've got into difficulty for exercising their lawful right to free speech. We try and help as many as we can. I've got Fraser Hudgton, our case management director, down here, Bryn Harris, our Chief Legal Counsel, and I want to bring them into the discussion a bit later, and hopefully they'll be able to answer some of your questions. We don't just do casework, though that is takes up about half our time. We also organise events like this one. We've got a couple of events coming up at the Backyard Comedy Club in Bethnal Green. We're hoping to organise a debate, possibly here, next January. We've got an online speakeasy with Frank Furedi. I'm interviewing him about his new book on October 25th. All of these are the benefits you'll get from joining the Free Speech Union. If by some chance you haven't already joined, on your chairs there should be flyers which have 2 QR codes on them. One to donate. We do depend upon donations in order to keep membership dues as reasonable as possible. If you're a student, a veteran on benefits, it's only $24.95 a year and you can pay monthly. If you're not in any of those categories, it's only $49.95 a year. And if you do get into trouble and we do end up helping you, you get much more than that back from us. But the only way we can continue to subsidise membership dues like that is if we get donations. So if you haven't joined, please join. QR code for that, or donate, QR code for that too. Anyway, on to the matter at hand. On this panel today, going from left to right, we have Nick Buckley, who I'm sure some of you will already know. He's already done a panel, one panel here today already. Nick's going to tell us his story in a moment. He set up a charity in Manchester about 15 years ago, and it's done amazing work with young people, particularly homeless young people in Manchester. He's going to tell you about his experience just at the beginning of the kind of BLM explosion last year. We've got Gillian Philip, the author of over 40 books, and she had a difficult experience last year when she came to the defense of J.K. Rowling. She'll tell her story in a minute. Lisa Keogh, who was until recently a student at Abertay University, who fell foul of what I'd be tempted to call the trans-Taliban, but I know that's a politically incorrect phrase, which I shouldn't use, but she'll tell her story in a second. We've got Sam Bayliss here, who had the unusual experience of contributing something to a magazine at Edinburgh University that was set up precisely in order to give students an opportunity to publish unorthodox dissenting points of view, but his point of view just turned out to be too unorthodox, too challenging, and his piece for this new magazine was sent down the memory hole. He's going to talk to you about that. And finally, Harry Miller. Again, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Harry. Quentin Tarantino has this great phrase. He was once asked who he wanted to be in life, and he said, I want to be the wrong guy, as in the movie when people say you picked on the wrong guy. Well, when the police came for Harry and accused him of committing a non-crime hate incident, they picked on the wrong guy, and he's going to tell you about the fight back. So, Nick, I thought we'd start with you. Do you want to just, I think we've got about 5 minutes, just tell us what you wrote a blog post, didn't you, for LinkedIn, in which you made some perfectly reasonable dissenting points about BLM.
Yeah, so it was June last year. We had protests in London by BLM. I'd never really heard of them before. So I decided to have a look about what they were. So I went onto their website, not a conspiracy website, their own website, and had a read of what they were saying. I was quite shocked. So I decided to write a 700-word blog, put it on LinkedIn about what I discovered. But basically saying what they were saying and then finishing it with what I would do if I wanted to improve the lives of black people in the UK today. It was on LinkedIn for a couple of weeks, fine. Some people agreed with it, some people didn't. But then someone copied the link and put it on Twitter, and then it went mental. Somebody set a petition up to have me fired from the charity I founded, and I was chief exec of. A volunteer resigned and used the word racist and Nazi in the email resignation, and the board panicked. The board consisted of 4 people who I'd appointed. 3 of them were personal friends. And within a couple of days, they emailed me in one line saying, "You're fired immediately." And that was the end of that. First week, I was a beaten man. Didn't know what had gone on. Never thought I could get cancelled. Never thought I would have been in trouble like that. And after a couple of days, I decided to take some advice. And it was my own advice that I'd given to tens of thousands of kids. And it was, get up, brush yourself down, and fight back. So I joined the Free Speech Union, and then Toby phoned me up the next day, and it was the first time I managed to get anything off my chest. I felt better after that. Free Speech Union then got me a solicitor involved pro bono. At that point, I had a little bit of savings, but all I'm thinking is, I'm probably unemployable now. I'm Nick the Nazi. How am I going to get another job? So the money I've got put away, I'm going to need that to live on. So I can't afford to waste all that with solicitors, but luckily we got a solicitor from Keystone Law involved who are fantastic. They looked at my contract, they looked at what I'd wrote, they looked at everything. And within a couple of hours, they said, clear cut, breach of contract. So we wrote to the board, and we basically said to the board, Nick's coming after your houses. He's going to sue you all personally, unless you resign. And this is how much they stuck up for themselves. Within 18 hours of them getting a letter, they all resigned in disgrace. Yay. These people can be beaten, and they can be beaten very easily. All you have to do is stand up and you say, no. That's all you have to do. Some cases are easier one than others. I'm not saying it'll be as easy as mine, but you have to say and use the word, no, I'm not doing that. No, I'm not saying that. Because when you end up in a really dark place and you say to yourself, how did I get here? The answer is, you walk there backwards, one small step at a time, and you never said the word no. That's how you got there. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Gillian, what happened to you?
So I was employed as an author. I'm a children's author. I've written all my own books, but I was also employed by a company called Working Partners, who are a kind of book packager. So they commission books, they get authors to write them, and I was taken on in about 2011 as one of the Erin Hunter team, which writes animal fantasy for middle grade kids. So I did that right up until last year, 2020. I'd always had a social media presence. I had always been quite open. I started giving my personal opinions about, certainly as early as 2014. I was talking about the Scottish referendum and issues surrounding that. And I'd never shied back from talking about political issues or contentious issues. And no publisher had ever worried about it. My agent didn't worry about it. It was all fine. So I started posting on transgender ideology and issues roughly about 2017, I'd say. Now, when I say that, I should add not transphobic, not anti-trans, just I have very strong concerns about self-ID. I've got nothing against trans people. So I was simply expressing my concerns about self-ID. Should it really be possible for intact male bodies, complete with penises and beards, to be in women's refuges, women's jails, and so forth? So that was basically it. But this turned out to be the most contentious issue I had posted on. So about 2019, my agent finally said, maybe you shouldn't be, posting so much stuff about that. So I sort of said, okay, anonymous account. So I said, right, I'm going to stick to professional stuff on my professional account, fine, and I'll have an anonymous account where I'll post my views. So fast forward to 2020, about May, and a friend of mine called Rachel Rooney, who is also a children's author, and she'd written this lovely picture book called My Body Is Me, and it was kind of encouraging children to be happy in their bodies, to be proud of their bodies. She was absolutely dragged, not so much by people in social media as by actual fellow children's authors. A sort of nasty little clique of children's authors had it in for her, said the book was transphobic, and basically tried to ruin her, and pretty much drove her out of children's writing. Now, at that point, I kind of outed my own anonymous account. I said, I cannot stay silent on this. This is my professional account, but if you want to read my opinions, go to my anonymous cat-spraddled account. That's me. At which point, the managing editor of Working Partners followed me on that anonymous account. Never said a word. Wasn't fussed. Just the way nobody from the publishers or anyone had ever complained, never said, you've got to stop that, So, about a month later, I think, I finally added the hashtag I stand with J.K. Rowling to my professional account. She'd had so much abuse, she'd had death threats, she'd had rape threats, and again I thought I can't keep my mouth shut about this. But it was blood in the water, and about 2 weeks later, I woke up on the 25th of June 2020 to a couple of critical comments, abusive comments on Twitter. I blocked them and moved on, but for 24 hours, it just kept coming, it snowballed. Eventually I was getting hundreds and thousands of abusive tweets, had to deactivate my account, and 24 hours after it began, I woke up, I went to sleep at 5, woke up at 9, agent was on the phone, Working Partners was on the phone. I knew they wouldn't be pleased, but I thought they might be slightly sportive. But anyway, they said, well, we're going to have to see what HarperCollins say, because they were the publishers in the States who mostly published these Erin Hunter books. HarperCollins got to the office at 9 a.m. New York time, 2 p.m. UK time, and at 9:01 New York time, I was fired by people who I knew personally, people I'd done a lot of work for, not all of it paid. I used to tour for the brand, and yeah, I was out in my year. They didn't ask for my side of the story. They didn't come back to me to say, how are you feeling? They just fired me. So that's kind of how I got cancelled. But I think the thing about it was they kind of expected me, as Nick says, to just roll over and take it. And I think the way that you defeat it is to fight back. It's to say, I'm not going to be quiet and be apologetic and roll into a corner and apologise for everything I've ever thought. You cannot do that because it's never enough. So I too approached the Free Speech Union, and they've been tremendously helpful to me. And I'm starting to retrain as an HGV driver.
That was our suggestion.
Yeah. So,
we'll never get you another job in
so
publishing,
far.
we said.
Yeah.
You'd have to retrain as a lorry driver. Anyway, one thing that you both have in common, I think, is that you expected people you knew, colleagues, friends, to be much more supportive when the axe fell, but they weren't. Do you have a sort of explanation in your head, either of you, for why it is that people don't stand by you? Why do they retreat so quickly once the mob targets you?
Because they're terrified for their own. I mean, that is the point of the cancellation. It's not the person it's aimed at. It's everybody else who's going to be too scared to say something.
I think the word for me is cowardice.
Yeah.
And we've become, I've said this in the last talk we did a few hours ago, we've become a nation of cowards. We're afraid of everything, and that's because our lives are so easy compared to what they used to be. And we don't know what hardship is anymore. And having someone on Twitter call your names and, having a go at you is so terrifying now that we will allow our friends to be crucified as long as I don't get called any nasty names. It's cowardice.
Yeah. So Nick is in the charitable sector and Gillian was in publishing, both areas that have become completely infected by the kind of authoritarian woke virus.
Yeah.
Very captured. But universities are probably at the absolute forefront of this battle. And I'd say a good third of the people that come to us for help are students. So it's really helpful to have Sam on this panel because Sam is currently a student at Edinburgh University. So Sam, tell us your story.
So yeah, I went to the University of Edinburgh blissfully ignorant that this wasn't going to be some space for the expressing of open ideas. Anyway, I have always liked to write, so I joined the student newspaper, and for a year and a half I kept my head down on the sports desk. It was quite easy to not upset anyone there. And anyway, after a bit of time at the student newspaper, I discovered a different student publication called The Broad, who, as you may be able to guess by their name, they were set up, as Toby alluded to earlier, to combat censoriousness on the University of Edinburgh's campus. So on their website, they make numerous claims, such as, I quote, "Free speech needs to be constantly pushed to its limits," and, quote, "The right to be offensive is a key facet of freedom of speech." So I saw this and, my ears were pricked up. I started writing for them. I wrote an article for them in March 2020 called "Should Wokeness Win?", in which I was looking into the virtues of perhaps having a colourblind attitude towards society. I quoted a Martin Luther King quote, which I'm going to share with you now because I think it is especially poignant. "Let us be dissatisfied until the day when nobody will shout white power, when nobody will shout black power, but everyone will talk about God's power and human power." So I wrote this article, and it was published in March 2020. I was told by my editor it was a, quote, well-written piece. Fast forward to June and the murder of George Floyd, and this very same editor emailed me to notify that this article had been taken down. It no longer existed online, and that I had, the article was, quote, "a denial of oppression," and that I had, quote, "diminished the experience of people of colour." And that my quoting of Martin Luther King was an issue because I'd imposed my identity as a white person onto his identity as a black person. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that means. But yeah, it was taken down. And, my initial reaction, much like those who have spoken previously, was shock. Not only had I been censored, but I'd been censored by, the people that were supposed to be upholding freedom of speech. Like, am I really such a terrible person? I thought long and hard about whether I really was a racist. It was a terrible, terrible time. But then I decided to get in touch with the Free Speech Union. Whilst, my livelihood wasn't on the line as perhaps Nick's and Gillian's were, but I was nonetheless supported. They wrote to the Broad twice. The Broad got back with, I think, a couple of lines which were useless. My article was never republished. I still check every now and then on the URL. It's not there. But, what I kind of got from the experience was, I got an article published in the Critic magazine, which, ironically had infinitely more views than my piece for The Broad ever had. And then also what has been really refreshing is this year, an organisation called Free Speech Champions has come into being. And we're a group of young people, mostly students, who are really looking to promote the virtues of the free exchange of ideas and the value of debate and discussion and disagreement. And so, yeah, we have recently, actually launched this week, created the New Taboo zine, which you can pick up in the main assembly hall. Sorry, little plug there, Toby. Yeah, so I think, we've got a discourse amongst higher education institutions which needs to be rediscovered. It needs to be reclaimed because, yeah, at the current, I'll elaborate much further later on. But yeah, I think we got to rediscover our ability to disagree.
Thanks, Sam. It's good that one theme emerging is quite an optimistic one, which is that even though the experience of being cancelled, being targeted by an outraged mob can be extremely traumatic when it's happening to you. And it happened to me at the beginning of 2018, and my reaction, like Nick's, was initially to kind of knuckle down, hide in my bunker. And you sort of have this sort of atavistic fear that people are out to get you, and that people passing you on the street might have read about it and might have this horrible, jaundiced, toxic view of you, and you feel this kind of primordial terror that people are going to come for you, a mob is going to come for you, jump out of Twitter and appear in front of you. But ultimately, if you do fight back and you get the right kind of support, it can be quite a positive experience in the end, and you do feel kind of renewed and invigorated, and good things out of my cancellation experience came the Free Speech Union, out of yours came the Free Speech Champion. So, Harry, tell us about what happened to you and how, in some ways, it has been a positive experience for you too.
It's been an incredibly positive experience. I was looking forward to a few years of sort of semi-retirement. I'm a naturally very, very lazy person who gets his thrills out of watching Netflix and walking the dogs. But I was doing my shopping. I was doing my wife's shopping, by the way. And I got a call that said that the Humberside Police turned up at my place of work because they were very concerned about the trans people at Immingham Dock. I told the police officer when I eventually spoke to him that there weren't really that many trans people at Immingham Dock. We'd only really just discovered gay people, and it really wasn't really a thing. But nevertheless, PC Gull from Humberside Police warned me that I was a danger to trans people by virtue of a single complaint that came from somewhere from the northwest. I said, okay, what is it that I've done? What is it that I've done? And they said, well, you retweeted a limerick. I'm like, well, I don't think I did retweet a limerick, but if you say so. And he said, but also there were 30 other tweets, and that if we hadn't spoken to you, the danger is that these would escalate into severe criminality. And I said, well, have I committed a crime? He said, no. I said, well, why are you here sort of talking to me? And he said, well, I need to check your thinking. Which, exactly. I said, okay, that's quite interesting. So you're a police officer, I've not committed a crime, and you need to check my thinking. He says, yes, that's right. I said, have you heard of George Orwell, 1984? And he said, no, surprisingly. And I pointed out that it was a dystopian novel and not a police operating how-to manual. Anyway, this quickly escalated, and the Assistant Chief Constable got involved, and he went public and said that it was necessary for the police to intervene in my thought life and my speech life, because had they not done so, that my actions as a raging transphobe would escalate into deep criminality. We asked them what criminality they had in mind. We asked them this at the High Court, actually, and they said the murder of Stephen Lawrence. So by tweeting not a limerick and one or two other bits of doggerel, they had in mind that intervention was necessary because somebody would end up dead at a bus stop. But by the way, it doesn't end there, because they also argued that in tweeting, and let me say some of the things that I tweeted. One of the things I tweeted was, Sheffield lasses know the difference between men and women. Now, you can see how that might escalate into a murder, can't you? Another thing I tweeted was I was assigned mammal at birth, but I identify as fish. Don't misspecies me, motherfuckers. And this was also deemed to be that transphobic that it would escalate to a murder. But not just murder, because murder is only stage 4 of a 5-stage process which I was embarked upon. Stage 5, incidentally, is genocide. So by tweeting, this is what the police, this is what Humberside Police and the College of Policing argued at the High Court, and then argued again at the Court of Appeal, because of course I whooped Humberside's ass. They were likened to the Stasi, the Checker, and the Gestapo by the good Mr. Justice Knowles. But in a strange twist of irony, the College of Policing got off the hook, because it turns out that whilst the guidance is entirely legal, the hate crime guidance is legal, following the guidance is not legal. So we figured that was fundamentally insane. And so we took the College of Policing to the Court of Appeal in March. And as we sit here and speak right now, we are waiting for a judgment to drop. And if we win, we will, in one fell swoop, dismantle the entire hate crime lunacy, which I'm very, very pleased about.
And just to be clear, Harry, when the police concluded that no crime had been committed, they nonetheless recorded this episode as a non-crime hate incident, and that has now gone effectively on your criminal record. And if you were to apply for a job working with children and your prospective employer did an enhanced DBS check whereby they got to see your criminal record, that would appear on it, and it could mean that you didn't get that job. And you might think this is a relatively rare occurrence. Perhaps it only happens with particularly zealous police officers in Humberside following the hate crime official guidance as laid down by the College of Policing with particular fastidiousness. But actually, the Telegraph did an FOI of all the police services in England and Wales last year and discovered that they had recorded 120,000 non-crime hate incidents between 2014 and 2019, which I think Harry calculated was something like 7 a day. Yeah. And that's things like people misgendering one another on Twitter. But it can really, it has a really chilling effect on free speech. So Harry has done tremendous work in trying to get the recording of non-crimes on people's criminal records, which really does sound like something out of 1984, declared unlawful by first the High Court and now the Court of Appeal. And we're awaiting that verdict, aren't we?
Yeah, what's so utterly terrifying about it is this, that the College of Policing hate crime guidance says that in order for a non-crime hate incident to be recorded against an individual, there doesn't need to be an incident and there doesn't need to be any evidence of hate. How about that? How about that? All there needs to be is perception. Somebody, doesn't have to be the victim, can just be anybody. If they perceive it to be hate, and by the way, the College of Policing define hate as antagonism, ill will, unfriendliness, and dislike. God bless them. So if you are hateful in that way, and somebody perceives it as such, then you carry this enhanced DBS check around with you for the next 6 years, no appeal possible.
And they often don't tell you if they've recorded these against you. You have to submit an access request in order to find out. Lisa, we're often told that bad as things are in England and Wales, with the police telling people who retweet doggerel to check their thinking, it's even worse north of the border. And you had quite a tough experience in your last year as a law student at Aberdeen. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so I was in my final year and I wanted to do intellectual property, but there was no space left on that. So I was left with gender, feminism and the law. So I had to do this. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? So I had to do gender, feminism and the law, because that's all that was left. And in the first class, we were speaking about men and women and like men fighting against women in mixed martial arts and things. And I was like, well, that's not fair. Because like, obviously, if you take Fallon Fox, he is a he, well, in my head. And so he was fighting with this woman and he fractured her skull in 38 seconds. And I pointed out, you know, he was a man up until he was 32. He had all the benefits of testosterone in his body, male puberty and things like that. So this was a man beating a woman up in the ring, he fractured her skull. So the lecturer said to me, so what would you define as a woman? And I didn't know, like, about any of this. I was busy mumming and looking after dogs and sheep and, like, being a housewife and all that sort of stuff. So I was like, a woman was like a person with a vagina and the ability to reproduce. And everybody started going crazy. So I was like, right, okay, it's a Teams call, so I'll just type it down so they can see what I'm saying. So I typed down a woman as a person with a vagina and the ability to reproduce. And they're like, oh, you're transphobic. And I'm like, no, I'm not. And then this kind of went on for a couple of weeks. So the next sort of big deal was, I think Sarah Everard had just been murdered. And they were saying, oh, all men are rapists. And I was like, well, no, they're not. And they were like, yes, they are, all men are rapists. And I was like, well, I've got a partner, I've got children. I know lots of men that are not rapists, so all men are not rapists. And they seemed to get really, like, happy and excited. And they were like, oh, yeah, let's keep getting going. So they started, like, really going at me, and they started attacking my children and things like that. They were like, oh, yeah, your children, I hope they get jumped in the street because they've got penises. They're going to grow up to be rapists and things like this. And I was like, right, okay. So at this point, I was quite annoyed. And I was like, you know what? You're nothing but men-hating feminists. And it wasn't an insult because they told me they hated men and they told me they were feminists. So I took the two statements and put them together. So I didn't think anything more of it. I didn't realise I'd done anything wrong. So it was mind my own business. I got an email from the university and it was like, in April saying you've been accused of making inappropriate comments in a class that could be discriminatory or whatever. So at first I was like, oh, screw this is just nonsense. So I ignored it until the next day, and I was like getting really worked up. So I wrote quite a scathing email, not scathing, but quite an upset email back to the women. I was like, you're accusing me of saying inappropriate things. X, Y, and Z has happened in this class. Why are you not doing anything about this? So I got to pick a date for my interview. At the interview, I was like, so what have I been accused of? And she's like, oh, we're going to tease it out. And I'm like, well, could you just tell me what I've been accused of? So she didn't until we sort of started getting questioned. And she was like, did you say that only women have vaginas? And I was like, what? Yeah. And it's like, can you see why that's offensive? And I was like, no, I can't see why that's offensive. Women don't have penises, they've got vaginas. Why is it offensive? And she's like, oh, you know, I'm asking the question sort of thing. You're not here to question me, blah, blah. Did you say that your class members were men-hating feminists? And I was like, yes, they said they were feminists. They said they hated men. I put the two things together. I didn't mean it nice, but it's not an insult if they're describing themselves as that. And then she was like, did you say all men are not rapists? I said, yeah. And what else did she ask me? Oh, did you say that men are stronger than women? And I was like, well, of course I did. I used to be a mechanic. So I know firsthand that, like, you know, I was in the garage, I couldn't lift certain things. I'd go, can you pick this up for me? I can't, not strong enough sort of thing. I didn't say that, but I was just like, oh, could you do this for me? Because I can't. So I know that men are stronger than women. And like every time she asked me a question, she's like, can you see why this is offensive? And I'm like, no, I can't. And obviously I left this meeting no further forward. I still didn't know what I'd done wrong, because obviously women do have vaginas, men do have penises, men are stronger, men have testosterone, men shouldn't be beating women up in MMA. So at this, I still didn't know what I'd done wrong. And a friend of mine had suggested going to the Free Speech Union. So I did, and Fraser helped me. He was fantastic through the whole thing. And I had another interview, but they'd sort of twisted the narrative by this point. So instead of it being a free speech issue, they were like, oh, you're misconduct. And I was like, well, all of these interviews were recorded, all of these classes, were recorded. So there was no misconduct, which is why they didn't uphold the complaint. But the complaint was never about misconduct. It was always about inappropriate comments. Now I'm at a point in my life where I did have a job secured leaving, and now nobody wants to employ me because they don't want to be seen to publicly support the transphobe. Which I don't deny being. I'm not a transphobe, but if somebody says to me, are you transphobic? I'm not defending that. If saying women have vaginas is transphobic, then I am transphobic.
And I think one important lesson from Lisa's case is, unlike in Nick and Gillian's case, even Sam's case, where there was no due process, they were found guilty and punished without being given an opportunity to put their side of the story, at least initially. In Lisa's case, there was a quasi-judicial process, not surprisingly because it was a law school, which you were put through. But one thing we often say in the Free Speech Union, even when people are exonerated at the end of one of these processes, often with our help, it's the process which is the punishment. Merely being put through a process like that and essentially being put on trial, and then, you know, and it hangs over your head even after you're exonerated.
Well, it's not just that. I was doing my final exams at this point, so I had this 2.5-month ludicrous investigation over my head while trying to do essays, presentations, and my dissertation. And it was stressful. Like, it was really, really stressful. I couldn't focus all the energy into what I wanted to because I was trying to focus on fighting this. And as much as I had the Free Speech Union there, and they were fantastic, it's still a weight on your shoulders. You don't know what's going to happen. So I think, yeah, the process was actually much worse than the result, getting let off. I still had to go through that 2.5 months of hell.
Okay, well, you've heard from our panelists. Now we'd like to hear from you. So we're going to take questions now.
As far as I'm concerned, what we have in this country is a hate crime industry. And at the heart of that is the College of Policing, which is effectively Stasi Uni UK. It's led by a man called Lord Herbert, who's also the Prime Minister's envoy on LGBT rights. The chair of the hate crime network in the British Society of Criminology is also an LGBT activist, Dr. Joe Smith, at the University of Brighton. Now, what we effectively have with the experience of all these people here is partly people that were terrified, as I think Nick was saying, of the attacks that were being made, but also we have... sorry, I lost my point there, beg your pardon. Anyway, the key point is that we've really got to fight against this hate crime industry and start, actual fact, targeting these people that are pushing this agenda and this stupid definition of what constitutes causing offence. Anybody that is perceived to have caused offence can end up with NCHI, non-crime hate incident against their name. And that's what we have to fight, and start fighting these people and targeting them.
Thank you.
So we've heard about individual bravery, and no doubt all the panellists are brave. And in an earlier meeting, we heard about individual boycotts. And I think I slightly disagree with Nick about people being cowards these days. I think people are in very vulnerable positions very often. So my question is, you know, there's a real problem if you're going to be sat down by the HR department and have to go through, you know, training on critical race theory or training on racial sensitivity when you know that the whole bloody thing's ridiculous. How would panellists suggest that we kind of oppose that collectively, and is there a role for the Free Speech Union in that? There's no role for, it seems, conventional unions very often, because my union, the teaching union, are all for decolonisation and they're all for critical race theory. So, you know, where do we look as individuals or a collection of individuals to kind of push back before we have to be subject to more and more of this stuff?
Yeah.
Hiya, I'm at university at Aberystwyth, and I held an event in my second year. I invited Ella Whelan to come and speak. I was a bit under the radar and managed to invite her, and brought up you know, a crowd of people to talk about the identity crisis. And it was quite successful, but it had quite a lot of people judged, not me personally because they didn't know me, but the person was sat in the event censoring it. Kind of reporting, she came up to me and said, I'm going to report if anything is offensive, which I found baffling. But on the other side, and a more optimistic view, I've come across a lot of lecturers and a lot of students who are completely opposed to this. The lecturer that was also speaking with Ella came up to me and said, this is really dangerous. I can't believe she came to censor this event. My question, and I want to ask for some advice, what the panel would suggest. I've come across a lot of individuals in the universities, professors and students who want to do something about it, who will voice opinion very kind of quietly that they are against it. What would you advise? How would you kind of suggest a collective effort to contradict what the university is silencing? And it's effectively the students' union in combination with the university, and that is what I find quite that's what I find to be the problem. The students' union cannot represent the students and the professors who don't want to. Sorry, losing my words. Who want to have free speech.
Yep.
So, what would your advice be for universities and for students?
Thank you. We'll take one more and then we'll go back to our panel.
So we've heard that these folks have all been very brave and done a wonderful job of fighting back. But it's also been very clear that for everybody involved, the process is the punishment, as you said. And so one of the things that I'm wondering about is what can we do to make the inappropriate application of that process have some cost to the people who apply it. One of the reasons that people don't go to litigation on a frivolous basis is because you face very significant costs when you do so. Is there perhaps some way of bringing some of that kind of risk to bear on university administrators who insist on applying these processes in such a cavalier way? I don't mean personal ruin, that's in no one's best interest, but there should be a downside to careless following of process.
Yeah. Good. Okay, well, the question by the student from Aberystwyth about what students can do on campus to push back against these attempts to control what they say, keep them within very narrow boundaries. What can they do, Sam? Could you recommend an organisation apart from the Free Speech Union that could help them?
Yeah, funnily enough, I can. So I recommend you do not hesitate and check out Free Speech Champions. Come and find one of us wearing a T-shirt. We've also got a stool in the Abbey Room. And then, yeah, on our website, we've got all sorts of information about how you can maybe start a free speech society at your university, which, takes a fair bit of bravery to do, but many of us have done it. I haven't done it, but many of my colleagues at Free Speech Champions have. So, yeah, there's a lot you can do, and there's so much information there which will help you work that out.
One of the, there was a policy exchange report about academic free speech recently, and it did some polling. And one of the encouraging results was that they asked people initially what their thoughts were when it came to choosing between safety and free speech. And initially they prioritized emotional safety, students for the most part. But then they read a short statement to them in defense of free speech, setting out the kind of elementary arguments in favor of free speech. And after they'd heard that, they then were much more inclined to prioritize free speech over emotional safety. And that, to me, suggested that if you can actually engage with students, if you can set out the case, get an opportunity to set out the case for free speech on campuses, you're gonna actually win a lot of them around. They often just haven't heard the case for free speech. They don't know what the arguments are in favor of it. So if you can get out there, like Sam and his colleagues in the Free Speech Champions are, and make that argument and help others make that argument, I think that will make a difference. The question from the member of the teaching union, Harry, what can we do to push back? Well, of course, you can join the Free Speech Union and you have the QR code on your seat. But you're right, I think unions in the 19th century, in many cases, part of their core purpose was to defend the free speech of their members, so they couldn't be sacked by their bosses for calling for better working conditions. And lots of unions seem to have lost sight of that original purpose, and even lobby groups set up to defend free speech, like the American Civil Liberties Union, seem to have lost sight of their original purpose, which was to defend free speech. So what can be done, Harry? How can we organise? What sort of institutional and organisational support can we give to people to defend their speech rights?
I think absolutely you're right, Toby. People need to join the Free Speech Union. I think if they, so that would cover, students. That would cover most places of work, I would think. I was sitting in a restaurant about a year or so ago with the activist Posey Parker, and the restaurant was absolutely packed out solid. And I said, Posey, how many people in here do you reckon have had a knock on the door from the police about something that they've said or thought? And we both agreed it was probably just me and her, in actual fact. And I said, well, how many people here do you think are scared stiff of saying something because of their HR departments? And we figured it was probably 80–90%. So this is where I think that the Free Speech Union is doing an absolutely fantastic job. And if we can scare the shit out of HR managers and directors by showing them that they are, in fact, breaking the law so often by using coercive measures, by misrepresenting the Equality Act, for instance, and as the gentleman said, turn it into some form of personal cost to them. This is one of the regrets that I had. When I took on Humberside Police initially, I made a sort of virtue point of not going after them for any money. I wish I had now. Not because I wanted the money, I mean I do, but for it to have cost them something. My chief area of interest is in the police. I get a lot of messages from police officers who have been badly let down by the Police Federation, because the Police Federation are entirely bought into the entire wokery of the various constabularies. So now we have, in effect, a police force of regular bobbies who have no representation whatsoever, because their unions have, their union, the federation, has thrown them to the dogs. So that's one of the areas that I would like to focus on next, is to give police officers something of a alternative voice.
Just going back to you, Bryn, I thought you might be able to help with this one. The gentleman asked, what can we do to raise the cost of people making vexatious, politically motivated complaints? One thing we've been debating in the Free Speech Union is, should we encourage people to make vexatious complaints about the sorts of people that make vexatious complaints, both to deter them, but also if we overwhelm the authorities with having to deal with these complaints, and they're not just dealing with complaints against people dissenting from the campus orthodoxy, then they might be less like, they might sort of become a bit more discriminating generally about how many to investigate. But we're slightly wary of adopting the other side's tactics. But Bryn, we thought about an amendment, didn't we, to the higher education bill, which could increase the cost of vexatious complaints. It's not entirely clear that the higher education bill will actually do that.
It's certainly true that most organisations won't relish the prospect of paying legal expenses, and that's often one thing that's going to drive them to some sort of settlement. You're not always going to have to fight to the bitter end. At some point, the organisation, be it a university or an employer, might decide that they really don't want to pay lawyers that much money, and I don't really blame them. In terms of the higher education bill, which is directly relevant to the gentleman's question, a key part of the government's thinking, and I think it's very wise, is that one way to make compliance with free speech duties a key goal of universities is to attach to it the same liability risk that, for instance, the Equality Act also imposes on universities, as well as other forms of law. What we see time and again, and I'm sure many people in this room have seen, is the absence of free speech from decision-making. It's simply not factored in until it's too late, when they get a nasty letter from Toby, and then they think, oh, we should have really thought about that. So the question is, how do we ensure that, in these various committees, in EDI groups, how do we ensure that it's simply part of the decision-making matrix? And I think the answer is to ensure that there is risk of liability. Now, the higher education bill will do that by creating the potential for students, academics, and others to bring civil claims in the courts, which means a claim in tort, which can include pretty considerable damages. And that, I think, is the way to get attention. I wasn't quite sure, Toby, about the amendment that we were thinking about.
I seem to think that we had something that we wanted to encourage. We wanted to change the bill slightly to make there a greater cost attached to bringing vexatious complaints, deluging complaint systems with politically motivated complaints. Maybe I've imagined that.
No, I mean, I certainly think it's important, and certainly one thing that we thought about was how can there be an encouragement of greater civility in academic debate? So to draw a distinction between academic freedom and free speech, and speech which is purely designed to intimidate and harass, as we've been seeing at the University of Sussex. And I think that's something that's very much worth doing as a matter of soft enforcement. It's perhaps not something we'd want to see courts getting involved in, but as a cultural change, I certainly think that would be very desirable.
Okay. Sure, Gillian.
When you say we don't want to use the same tactics as these kind of vexatious complainers, I think that's true, but it's not necessary to go after individuals to use the same kind of tactic. What I think needs to happen more often, and we saw some of it this week, is the actual companies, organizations, universities they're the ones who need to be shamed for caving to this stuff. As I always think, scorpion's going to scorpion. You're never going to stop vexatious complainers from, like, for instance, in my case, the company caved to what was essentially a bunch of anonymous, abusive. I don't think most of them were even children. Some of them might have been teenagers, some of them might have been overgrown teenagers, some of them were furries. If you don't know what a furry is, be careful how you Google. And just plain pervs. I mean, there were some accounts after me that were just, And the fact is that the publishing companies are caving to those people. What kind of company are you? They need to be shamed for caving. The individuals are going to do it anyway. But we saw it this week when Kathleen Stock she was the subject of a horrible campaign to get her fired at the University of Sussex, but people fought back. People said, University of Sussex, shame on you, don't do it. And it worked. Now, they didn't have to go after the individuals. What happened was you have to pressure the university, pressure the corporations. Corporations don't have souls. They don't care about discrimination, real or imagined. They go after the money. It's as simple as that. And if they're shamed into not caving to these frantic kind of, I mean, the letter that went out apologising for my dreadful behaviour after I was fired went to people like, the managing editor was writing, Dear Xenon with an X, I'm so sorry about, Xenon with an X, I bet he wasn't christened, and they're just anonymous overgrown kids. And it's the companies that need to feel shame, not the anonymous overgrown kids.
Yes, I mean, one of our tactics in the Free Speech Union is if we can increase the cost on institutions on caving into these demands, then that's the way to win. Often they're not caving into them because they're politically motivated, because they agree with the ideological position of the complainants. They just want a quiet life. They just want to take the path of least resistance. So if you can make it noisier to give in than to fight, then that's the way to win. Let's take some more questions.
I work in higher education, and I wanted to say that one of the most bewildering factors has been the speed and ease with which institutions have crumbled. And I just want to put a bit of context as to why. Because in universities, you've got to bear in mind there's been a big power shift in recent years. Ever since the fees were brought in, students are much more consumers. And that language is very much part of the university culture. So you'll hear students refer to themselves not just as students, but as fee-paying students. And that means that there is a sort of desperate wish not to antagonise the student body, particularly the student union. And that's the other institution, I think, which needs to be mentioned in the discussion. Coupled with that is a desperate competition for students ever since the cap on numbers was removed a few years ago, so that, in a sense, if higher education is a market, it's one in which the power shift has moved very much in the interests, as it were, of the consumers. And that's why I couldn't agree more. You need to make authorities more scared of the consequences of giving in than of the activists who make them. But bear in mind, that's the sort of context in which you're working. And in other words, it's not just wanting a quiet life. There are economic reasons why universities will take that line of least resistance.
Can I ask you a question, which is, so do you think that the creation of safe spaces, the prohibition on microaggressions, the introduction of trigger warnings, the decolonisation of reading lists for fear that they might make some people feel unsafe and excluded, all of that stuff, is that driven then by the students as powerful consumers, or is it driven by a kind of misguided sense of needing to protect the students because they are now the consumers, the people paying our wages?
It's two things, and possibly three. One is, in certain universities, I think that is the case in students. I work at Anglia Ruskin University, which is the sort of Cambridge equivalent of Oxford Brookes, and we don't tend to get this. Our students very often are from the sort of working background, first people in their families to go to university. They have degrees to get, they tend to get their heads down. They don't really sort of, this is more of a luxury thing. We have another university in Cambridge also, I'm told. And that is, there you will, it's well known, there's much more of it. So partly from students, partly from, I think partly because it is a fashion.
Okay.
And I think that's a factor.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Listening to all those stories, and obviously it's very clear that cancel culture does exist, and there is this bewildering attempt to sort of deny it amongst people who work in higher education. There's a bit of a tension here, though. I was just sort of reflecting on, the kind of cowardice and why don't people speak up, and the sort of self-censorship that was alluded to here. And I kind of struggle with it a bit, because the problem is that while there are all these sort of terrible incursions on free speech in higher education, I think there's also a kind of sense in which people kind of over-assume that they can't say things. The number of times people say, well, you can't say anything. It's like, well, yeah, you can actually. I've worked in a number of jobs, and actually it's still quite an open place. And it's quite important to have these discussions and to keep having them. And I just wondered if there was a way of trying to sort of also bring that kind of normalisation back of, how it's important to have conversations and how they still do happen. Even despite all these kind of demonstrable problems going on. Could I ask another question as well?
Quickly.
Compelled speech. I wondered if you'd had any cases about that, because that's one of the things that worries me, that you can kind of sort of take responsibility for being called on something you have said, but there seems to be a growing trend to kind of have to sign up to something else, otherwise silence is complicity, and I wondered if you'd had cases about that.
Yeah, okay, good.
I'd like to focus on the media, particularly certain sections of the public service broadcasting, who are very censorious of any attempts to criticise social justice ideology. And my question is there a possibility for groups like the Free Speech Union to organise a campaign which would put pressure on these media institutions who are critical of that kind of activity, particularly, as I say, the public service broadcasting unions?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm a student at Cambridge, and I have been here for the last 4 years, and I've been really ashamed of everything that has been coming through the institution, and I'm very, very pleased that Stephen Toop is leaving, finally. But just in response to what's been said previously, I definitely think that it's a case of the students pushing and just having no pushback whatsoever. I think Stephen Toop is one of the sort of least backbone people I've found, and it's not at all that he's ideologically in favour of it. He just doesn't want to trouble his students at all. And so I really hope that we introduce someone new with a bit of backbone to replace that. But I think definitely it's a race to the bottom where students are pushing, but they're getting no pushback. So it's just who can create these new policies quicker.
Yeah, thank you. We had a couple of questions there about higher education. One thing I'm curious about is when your antagonists claimed that things you had said were harmful and they found them upsetting, they were triggered by them, were they being sincere? Did they really feel injured by what you'd said, or were they just pretending to in order to promote a particular political agenda?
They were not offended. I actually think it was a deliberate ploy. I was very quiet throughout uni. I didn't take part in the drinking stuff. I didn't really socialise with people. These were all younger people. And when it came to, obviously, debates, I was always quite vocal. And I think because it was all online, they were able to say things that they wouldn't have normally said. But I think they were annoyed that I'd said these things and stood up by the truth. So they were like, right, we're going to put this bitch down. And I think that's what they tried to do. And it was more that they just didn't like me than they didn't like what I was saying. It was like they were trying to find offence in everything that I was saying. They were trying to find a way to take offence to everything that I said. So they were absolutely not offended, because women having vaginas is not transphobic. Men being stronger than women is not transphobic. So no, they were not offended. There was nothing offensive that I said. And even if I did know about all the J.K. Rowling stuff and everything else that goes on, I would still say what I said now. And not because it's offensive, because it's true. And how they took offence to that is beyond me. They were absolutely not offended.
One of the things that often strikes me about outrage mobs who complain about you having given offence or having said something hateful is that they're completely uninhibited, Gillian, about being unbelievably nasty and vituperative, and in some cases far more misogynistic than they're accusing you of being. I mean, it's as though once you've been othered as someone who has breached one of their sacred values, even if that sacred value is not giving offence, then all bets are off, you're fair game, and you have this kind of unleashing, this torrent of unpleasant abuse.
Yes, and it's, I mean, some of the stuff I got with, I mean, it was nothing I have said even remotely came close to some of the stuff that was being fired at me. I mean, it was just, you know, I wouldn't even quote it. It was absolutely foul. It was death threats, you know, hoping I died in the most horrible, vile ways possible, you know, preferably being raped first. And that's, but I think this is it. There's a certain number of people, I think it doesn't matter what cause it was. There's a certain element who are going to do that and they will latch onto anything. It's like the people who just didn't like you, Lisa, so they latched onto that. So there is a certain kind of person who will latch onto it, and that's why I think they are almost irrelevant in this. These rather vile human beings who are just basically sitting in bed, they're beside the point. That's why companies who cave to vile little nasties in their mother's basements, that's the people who should be truly ashamed. You know, the scorpions are just being scorpions. It's the people who are obeying the demands and diktats of the scorpions who need to be shamed.
Sure.
If you read the College of Policing guidelines, it says this: a decrease in hate crime and hate is not an appropriate target because it will demotivate officers. That's what the College of Policing guidance says. So what they then do is they then actively recruit people who are offended. Actively recruit. In my case, this anonymous person was granted an anonymity order on account of them being vulnerable. They weren't vulnerable at all. They have a history that dates back to 2014 of being abusive trolls, to the extent that Julie Burchill actually wrote about them in a Spectator column. Because that is, but we weren't allowed to know this. I found out about my particular accuser because there was a whistleblower. But the police redacted their details and hid them from me, hid them from the court, and duped the court into granting them a court order. What I'm saying is the College of Policing are actively, and the police forces are actively encouraging people to make vexatious accusations because they have as one of their clear targets an increase in hate.
Let's take some more questions.
Hi, I'm just wondering what on earth we can do when last week on the news Boris Johnson himself couldn't decide who had cervixes. I'm listening to these stories and I'm thinking the things that people are being accused of and these settled ideas, they're lies. They are biologically untrue. And I'm thinking, it's like Alice through the looking glass. It's like the world has gone mad. And why isn't anybody saying, excuse me, you are defending something that offends my intelligence. It offends reality. It isn't real. And instead of everybody collapsing into a heap and wondering what these people are going to do to us, why aren't we turning around and saying, what are you on? Get out of my way. I absolutely agree with Nick. And it's not about people being cowardly. It's about people being afraid to be brave. And I think that's what we need to start doing again. Start being brave. Don't be afraid.
Given that there seems to be resistance to the government doing anything, is there any chance with universities of using the market like some kind of ranking of how woke universities are and trying to... Have you guys thought of publishing like a list of the most and least woke universities and trying to steer students away, given that they're so concerned about student numbers now? Do you think that might have an effect?
Good, yep.
Just wanted to say I'm glad I came to this session, because in the morning I started off with a session on heresy, free speech, and so on and so on. And pretty much the main question I had in the morning coming in was, what to do has been answered in this session to a large extent. But what I'm glad about this session in particular is the reframing of the question. So in the morning, there was talk about, heretic tactics and so on and so on. The heresy is on the other side, as the lady just said. To paraphrase Terry Egerton, woke cancel culture and the rest of it, postmodernity or postmodernism, critical theory, is in essence the modern day version of what the Middle Ages knew as the heresy of Fideism. And if we keep that in perspective, then we will know how to fight back. And just to say the last thing, I hear a lot of talk on how to fight critical race theory and so on. Those are derivations. The motherlode is critical theory. And I should know something about that. I wrote a PhD on it.
We had a question about whether we could do something about the role the BBC has more or less assigned to itself as an enforcer of these orthodoxies and an organisation that doesn't often give heretics an opportunity to appear. And one thing you've done since your experience is you've begun broadcasting on talk radio, on GB News, and one way of trying to get the BBC to be a bit more impartial and not take sides on these issues is to challenge them, not internally, but with other competing broadcasting organisations. How successful do you think they've been? I mean, do you feel that you have been given a voice and given an opportunity to articulate another heretical point of view, or do you feel pretty marginalised being on things like GB News and talk radio?
I speak to lots of people all the time who've seen me on GB News, or have listened to me on talk radio. Obviously, the numbers aren't the same as the BBC, but the BBC is a good example of what you can do as an individual when you say no. So what do? You cancel your licence fee. And that's what you need to do. What we keep talking about is what can someone else do for us? What can that organisation do to make us safer or to protect our freedom of speech? And the answer is hardly anything. The person who can do it is you. And when I use the word cowardice, I've thought about this one. I just wrote a book on cowardice, comes out in November. And I use the word meaningfully. I thought about this. It is cowardice. It isn't being afraid. Nothing wrong in being afraid. That gets you going. That makes sure you look out for danger. Cowardice is when you're afraid and you know what you should do, but yet you still don't do it. That's cowardice. Freedom is not free. People have to pay for freedom, and they pay for it with their lives, with their blood, and they pay for it with being uncomfortable. And that's what you all need to do. You need to look at your lives. You need to look at the decisions you make. And you need to say to yourself, somebody talks about HR sending them on to a CRT course. Well, of course, I don't want you losing your job over that. I don't want martyrs falling on your sword over one incident. But what you can do, you can phone in sick that day and not take it. What you can do is if you're an England football supporter and you go to the England games and you boo them taking the knee, well, you've booed. How about you don't go? But what we're looking for all the time is something that's not going to impact us and make us uncomfortable. So I'll go along with this and I'll complain and moan about it, but I'm not going to do something that will affect me a little bit negatively. That's where it needs to change, otherwise nothing else will change.
There was a question about compelled speech, and this came up recently because matriculating students at St Andrews University had to undergo some unconscious bias training. They had to take a course. And not only did they have to complete the course before they could matriculate, but they had to then answer this questionnaire. And one of the questions was, do you think that acknowledging your personal guilt has helped you overcome your unconscious bias? Which is sort of an odd question, because if the bias is unconscious, well, how do you know? But essentially, and you had to give an affirmative answer. You had to say yes in order to matriculate. It wasn't that you had to acknowledge your personal guilt exactly, but you had to affirm that the premise of the unconscious bias training course was correct. Acknowledging your personal guilt would reduce your unconscious bias, lead to less discriminatory behavior. Now, as a matter of social science, empirically, the evidence that unconscious bias training courses have this effect is extremely threadbare. So you're effectively being compelled to say something that if you knew anything about it, you probably thought wasn't true. And we do think that is a breach of the European Convention on Human Rights, and that's the interpretation anyway that the European Court of Human Rights gave in a famous case about compelled speech with the bakers having to bake the gay cake, whatever. So we do think that they are behaving unlawfully, and we have had some successes where Somerville College, for instance, it also introduced an unconscious bias training course, and it required students to give affirmative answers to the questionnaire they had to complete after the course. And if they didn't, they got into trouble, and we got them to at least not insist on that part of it. So I think you can do a little bit about compelled speech. Were you itching to come in here, Harry? No. Okay. Let's have some more questions.
Hi, I joined the diversity and inclusion strand at my workplace because I thought I may as well, just to see what they were saying and to see what was going on there. And it was worse than I thought it was going to be. And somebody proposed the idea that we should really, really be pushing rainbow lanyards and pronouns in the bios. And I just, my heart was thumping out of my chest because I thought, I joined so I could say no to these things. And it was really hard to do, and it was incredibly unpopular. But I feel like they are in an echo chamber where they understand, pronouns in bios, I'm sure everybody here knows what that means. But when I go, I'm the only one in my social circle of my family who's even on Twitter. And so I don't know anybody personally who's on Twitter, and they all are with us. They all think that this is ridiculous. They think it's a lot of grandstanding. They think it's a lot of just sort of pandering and catering to a very, very fringe movement. And what they're not aware of is they might be the majority, and it might be a fringe movement, but it seems to be the fringe movement who turns up at diversity and inclusion committees, and so on and so forth. So I feel like we do have most people on our side, but I don't have any evidence except my own personal, experience. So, but even most people think you can't change sex, and that only women have vaginas, and that white people aren't born guilty. So how do we spread the word to the kind of masses who think, oh, that's a load of nonsense, nobody has to worry about it, nobody listens to them? Because I feel like those are the only people who are being listened to, and that most of us, not in this room, are unaware that it's those fringe people that seem to be driving everything. So how do we spread that word and make people know, actually, you do need to turn up and say things?
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, just wanting to pick up on that question from this lady here. We know this institutional capture is taking place all over, whether it's with the police, higher education, and I'm thinking about ordinary secondary schools as well. And for the next generation that are coming through, getting to university perhaps in a few years' time or out into the workplace, is there any mileage perhaps in organising some kind of rolling programme of free speech marches to try to give confidence to people that they don't have to keep their heads down all the time and keep self-censoring into perpetuity? Any mileage in that from the FSU? Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, I know Lisa's case, as you can imagine. The thing I think is quite interesting about this is that there seems to be two dynamics that seem to be interconnected. One's ideological, so like we've just been talking about diversity type stuff. And the other one is kind of process, human resources stuff. And they both seem to be interconnected by the framework of vulnerability. So the diversity framework seems to be around this idea of protected characteristics. And that seems to be a key dynamic. And then the human resources, and what's happening at universities is they essentially look at students as being vulnerable. So you have in most universities now, I think, sort of pages that encourage students to tell tales, right? And some of them are almost called tell tales page. And what's interesting about that, that actually seems to breach the human resource process, because one of the first things they say in human resources is if you've got an issue, you should go to the person first. And what universities are encouraging students to do is to make complaints against people before they actually go to that individual. And what I think you found in the case of Lisa is that what the university comes out and says is it's not just what Lisa said, it's the way she said it, right? And the idea being it's intimidating, it's vulnerable, and so on and so forth. So what you seem to have at universities is this kind of strange form of infantilization where instead of going to a university and coming out as an adult, you're actually being trained to be more childlike. And I'm wondering if one of the things, whether it's the Free Speech Union can do this or not, but one of the key things seems to me is that we need to re-establish the idea of the importance of knowledge, because free speech isn't a good in and of itself, although it is, but in the context of a university, it's vital because you want to have a clash of ideas to actually get to something, right? And that seems to be a problem for me, that universities are becoming therapeutic institutions rather than realizing that actually the whole point of them is the development of knowledge. And that seems to be a key something that needs to be promoted. The free speech isn't just for the hell of it in a university context. It's absolutely vital if it's going to be the institution it's meant to be.
Yeah. Sam, I wanted to come to you. In making the case for free speech to students, you must come up against this kind of prejudice, this assumption that if you're defending free speech, you're defending the right of people to say upsetting and offensive things. And why do we want to do that in our community and make things nastier?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, excuse me, what I find is a lot of people are pretty lazy in their engagement in these discussions. And this comes back to the deterioration of discourse at universities. So take, for instance, the case of Neil Thin. Now, a friend of mine, it was his personal tutee. This is a lecturer at Edinburgh who got suspended, for those of you that don't know, and has later been cleared. But she came round for a cup of tea, this friend of mine, and just in passing said, oh, my personal tutor has been suspended. He's a little bit racist, a little bit homophobic. And I was like, hang on a minute, where did you read that? Can you tell me a little bit more, justify it? And she's like, oh, I saw someone posted it on Facebook. And, it made me want to almost rip my head out that there's such a surface level engagement with these big issues. I look at, there was an email that went around calling for the decolonisation of the English literature curriculum at Edinburgh last summer. Conversations that need to be had. But this email, which had an open letter attached, said in bold writing, you do not need to read the whole letter to sign it. So, it's beyond belief that this is our institutions of higher education, that we've lost this thirst for knowledge and have become nodding dogs to therapy and to comfort.
One of the reasons the police, I think, Harry, one of the reasons the College of Policing have got their hooks into the police force, insofar as they have, is because many policemen want to protect the vulnerable. They want to feel that they're doing something really helpful and morally worthwhile. They are protecting the weakest and most vulnerable members of our society. How did the idea get embedded that certain points of view, certain expressions, certain opinions are actively harmful to already beleaguered minorities? Why were the police so easily persuaded of this?
I don't know why they were so easily persuaded. I think it's a lack of critical thinking. I think that they were desperate to relieve themselves of the guilt handed to them on a plate by Macpherson in terms of their response to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. But what the police did, because the Lawrence inquiry, it asked them to hold a mirror up to themselves and look at their own attitudes. And what they did is they deflected it. What they did is they took the lessons of the Macpherson report and tried to apply those to everybody else. So it's you check your thinking is far easier than me check my thinking. That's what they did. The other problem is this. Following my High Court victory, I had a sit-down meeting with the Chief Constable of Humberside. And I said to him, look, I kind of understand why an enthusiastic young officer came off a course and did what he did and got it entirely wrong. What I don't understand is why somebody up the chain of command didn't apply some common sense. Now then, this was chilling. The Chief Constable looked me in the eye and said, Harry, what you must understand is common sense is not an appropriate tool for a police officer. Because it leads to unpredictable outcomes. What we need is more guidance. In other words, we've ditched critical thinking for a reliance on spoon-fed guidance. And I think it's no coincidence that the College of Policing have now insisted that all police officers must be graduates. Why? Because they want people who have learnt how not to think.
I think this has been an incredibly stimulating discussion. We've got a few minutes left. I just want to give Gillian and Nick and Lisa a chance to just say their final piece for 1 minute each, and then I'll close the afternoon. Gillian, do you want to go first?
Okay. I was afraid you were going to say that. I think what is most painful about the fact that what happened to me in my work environment is that this was the publishing industry. And it is endemic in the publishing industry. The publishing industry is supposed to be about freedom of expression. It's about creativity. It's about not being scared to say things. And it's the publishing industry is now scared to say things. They're scared to defend their authors. They cave as soon as there's a mob. And it's not what publishing is supposed to be about. And they've kind of lost sight of it. And the saddest thing is that publishers know there's a problem here. They know there's a problem. And they know that their writers aren't writing for themselves. They're not writing for an audience. The writers are writing for a future mob. They're worried about, they're thinking ahead all the time, what's somebody going to be offended by, what's going to get me in trouble, what's going to get me cancelled on Twitter. That's no way to have a thriving, creative publishing industry. And publishers know there's a problem. They let it go too far. They let bloggers and social media commentators they thought they were getting cheap book reviews and publicity when they started sending books out to book bloggers and online reviewers. They didn't realize that they were going to start not just having an opinion about the book, they were going to start wanting to control who the authors were, what the authors were thinking, what the authors are writing about. And it's kind of what's happened. And publishers got themselves into this. They're now in a purity spiral. And I don't know how they're going to get out of it, but this ain't publishing as we know it, and it's sad.
We get out of it by winning your case and punishing them. Nick, a minute from you.
I'm still very positive. I think we'll beat this, and I think we'll beat this quite easily. I think it's going to take a decade, but we'll only start beating it when people stand up and people start talking about it like we are today, like we are in this building. So thank you, everybody who came today. But you need to speak to your friends. We need to get to a stage where we point at people and we go, the king is in the all together, because we know they're talking complete rubbish and they're idiots. We need to point them out and do your little bit, because you know what? Our gang is bigger than their gang. There's 68 million of us. There's a couple of 100,000 idiots. That's all there is. And if you all do your little bit, all that adds up to a tsunami of change, and it can be done, and I'm extremely positive.
My final thoughts are basically just don't back down. So what I do is I speak to people. I spoke to people in the airport last night. I spoke to people on the flight. I'm always flagging this up. And I think the more of us that don't back down, the more people will stand up. I'm not as optimistic as Nick. I don't think it's going to be changed in the next 10 years. I think it's going to take longer than that, because we've slowly been getting conditioned to do as we're told and to not speak up. But no, my final thoughts are, If somebody tries to put you down, get up and start shouting louder. I didn't have Twitter before this. I now have Twitter. I share my thoughts on there. I refuse to be silenced, and it's probably cost me like future jobs, but I don't care.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. As I said at the beginning, if you want to join the Free Speech Union or donate to the Free Speech Union, the QR code is on the leaflet that you're sitting on or is beneath your chair. We have 2 stalls here, one immediately outside, one outside the entrance to the main auditorium. We'll be there for the rest of the afternoon. Come and talk to us. And just a big thank you to our panel. I think Lisa's right. One way in which you can start to fight back is by setting an example yourself, by being courageous, by pushing back. It takes guts to get up when you've been knocked down and fight back. And so please, can we hear it for our panel of gutsy fighters?